As World War II drew to a close, the alliance that had made the United States and the Soviet Union partners in their defeat of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, began to fall apart. Both sides realized that their visions for the future of Europe and the world were incompatible. Joseph Stalin, the premier of the Soviet Union, wished to retain hold of Eastern Europe and establish communist, pro-Soviet governments there, in an effort to both expand Soviet influence and protect the Soviet Union from future invasions. He also sought to bring communist revolution to Asia and to developing nations elsewhere in the world. The United States wanted to expand its influence as well by protecting or installing democratic governments throughout the world. It sought to combat the influence of the Soviet Union by forming alliances with Asian, African, and Latin American nations, and by helping these countries to establish or expand prosperous, free market economies. The end of the war left the industrialized nations of Europe and Asia physically devastated and economically exhausted by years of invasion, battle, and bombardment. With Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and China reduced to shadows of their former selves, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the last two superpowers and quickly found themselves locked in a contest for military, economic, social, technological, and ideological supremacy. Although the United States and the Soviet Union reached an agreement at Potsdam in August 1945 as World War II was ending, this was the final occasion on which they cooperated for quite some time. Each remained convinced that its own economic and political systems were superior to the others, and the two superpowers quickly found themselves drawn into conflict. The decades-long struggle between them for technological and ideological supremacy became known as the Cold War, so called because it did not include direct military confrontation between Soviet and U.S. troops. The Cold War was fought with a variety of other weapons: espionage and surveillance, political assassinations, propaganda, and the formation of alliances with other nations. It also became an arms race, as both countries competed to build the greatest stockpile of nuclear weapons and also competed for influence in poor nations, supporting opposite sides in wars in some of those nations, such as Korea and Vietnam. In February 1945, the Big Three gathered in Yalta, Crimea, in the Soviet Union. FDR represented the United States of America, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, to discuss post-war Germany. Germany was split into four zones: Britain to the northwest, France to the southwest, the United States of America to the southeast, and the Soviet Union to the northeast, which included Berlin, the capital of Germany, ending up in the Soviet zone. Berlin itself would also be split into four separate zones. In July and August 1945, Stalin, Churchill, and Harry Truman, President of the U.S. since FDR's death in April 1945, met in Potsdam, Germany, together to decide how to administer Germany, which had agreed to unconditional surrender 9 weeks earlier on May 8th. Victory in Europe Day. The goals of the conference also included the establishment of post-war order, peace treaty issues, and countering the effects of the war. Potsdam Conference failed to settle disagreements on post-war Poland and post-war Germany. In addition, the Soviet Union continued to expand, occupying more Central and Eastern European nations. When Stalin refused to budge on any of the Allies, the United States and Great Britain's demands, Potsdam affirmed that Germany would be divided between the West and the East. The West would unify into one nation, friendly to the U.S., democracy, and capitalism, and the Russian zone survived as a pro-Soviet communist state. In the post-World War II Civil War that erupted in China, the United States supported Chiang Kai-shek, even though his government was corrupt, incompetent, and not very popular. The American government supported Chiang Kai-shek over Mao Zedong because the United States could not and would not support a communist state in China. When China succumbed to the Chinese Communist Revolution, becoming a communist state under Mao Zedong's regime in 1949, another strategy the U.S. employed was abandoning the strict occupation policies of Japan under General Douglas MacArthur and lift restrictions on industrial development and encouraged rapid economic growth. A strong, pro-American, democratic, capitalistic influence in Japan could hold communist China in check. The policy of containment would come to be synonymous with the Cold War. Rather than attempting to create a unified world or destroy communism where it already existed, the U.S. and its allies would work to prevent Soviet and communist expansion. Joseph Stalin was willing to murder and exile millions of his own to protect his form of communism, and would grow even more defensive as capitalism encircled around him. The fact that the ideals of communism and capitalism do not align, as the two world powers both would go to great extent to protect their ideology. In 1947 and 1948, President Harry Truman sought to provide $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey to protect them and contain them from Stalin's influence in the Mediterranean and Iran. This policy became known as the Truman Doctrine. Truman said, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." The John Birch Society is an advocacy group supporting anti-communism and limited government. It has also been described as a radical right-wing and far-right organization. Some during the Cold War, like Robert Welsh, a retired candy manufacturer, believed that containment was a weak response to communism and that it was a form of appeasement. The John Birch Society is significant because it demonstrates that there were people and groups who wanted to fight communism, especially communists living in America. The JBS was viewed as an extremist organization, but represented one stance on the significant threat and danger facing the United States. They also believed that containment abandoned friendly nations like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. The Marshall Plan was an economic plan announced by Truman's Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, to provide economic assistance to all European nations, even the Soviet Union, if they would join in drafting a program for recovery. Russia and the Eastern Satellite nations rejected it, but 16 Western European nations joined to create the Economic Cooperation Administration that would help rebuild Western Europe. The Marshall Plan led to the United States pumping $13 billion into Western Europe, helping spark economic revival. And by the end of the 1940s, industrial production was up 64%. Communist strength had declined, and opportunities for American trade had revived. The National Security Act of 1947 was a law enacting major restructuring of the United States government's military and intelligence agencies following World War II. The majority of the provisions of the act took effect on September 18, 1947. The act merged the Department of War, renamed as the Department of the Army, and the Department of the Navy, headed by the Secretary of Defense. It also created the Department of the Air Force and the United States Air Force, which separated the Army Air Forces into its own service. It also protected the Marine Corps as an independent service under the Department of the Navy. Aside from the military reorganization, the Act established the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency, the U.S.'s first peacetime non-military intelligence agency. The National Security Council, NSC, operating out of the White House, part of the executive branch, would govern foreign policy and military policy. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, would be responsible for collecting information through open and covert methods. Essentially, the National Security Act gave the president expanded powers with which to pursue the nation's international goals. What was the Berlin Airlift? After the United States, Britain, and France merged the three western zones of Germany into the new West German Republic, including doing the same with Berlin, still inside the Soviet zone, Joseph Stalin responded in 1948 by imposing a tight blockade around the western sectors of Berlin in an attempt to force the Allies into abandoning Berlin altogether. Truman refused to allow this to happen, but didn't want war. So to challenge the blockade, he ordered a massive airlift of food, fuel, and other needed supplies into West Berlin. The airlift lasted 10 months, transporting 2.5 million tons of food and other material to keep the city of 2 million people alive. In the spring of 1949, Joseph Stalin removed the blockade. The tension involved in this crisis led the United States and other Western European nations into forming NATO. On April 4, 1949, 12 nations signed an agreement to establish the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. It was created to protect the NATO nations so that when one nation was attacked, it would be considered an attack against all. NATO also would maintain a standing military force in Europe to defend a threat of a Soviet invasion. NATO consisted of the United States, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. The formation of NATO eventually spurred the Soviet Union to create its own alliance with the communist governments in Eastern Europe. It was formalized in 1955 and became known as the Warsaw Pact, with 8 members. It's significant in that both NATO and the Warsaw Pact were organized to protect itself from invasion of the other. The Warsaw Pact included the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. The combination of the Soviet Union successfully exploding its first atomic weapon and China becoming communist under Mao Zedong's leadership, all in 1949, Harry Truman called for a thorough review of American foreign policy. The result was the National Security Council report, issued in 1950 and commonly known as NSC TAC 68. It outlined a shift in American position. It included a distinction between areas of vital interest to the United States and areas of less importance. It also called for sharing military burden of protecting Western nations. Most importantly, NSC TAC 68 argued that the U.S. could no longer rely on other nations to take the initiative in resisting communism. The U.S. must move on its own to stop communist expansion virtually anywhere it occurred, regardless of the intrinsic strategy or economic value of the lands in question. To do this, it called for permanent expansion of American military power and a defense budget almost 4 times the previously projected figure. Better known as the GI Bill of Rights and passed during World War II, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 provided home loans, education, and job training subsidies to veterans. It was controversial in how it was actually implemented in American society. Some received the benefits, others did not, or found it cumbersome to get the benefits. Nonetheless, the original GI Bill provided a range of benefits for returning World War II veterans. Truman's Fair Deal was a 21-point domestic program that called for expansion of Social Security benefits, the raising of legal minimum wage from 40 to 65 cents an hour, a program to ensure full employment through aggressive use of federal spending and investment, a permanent Fair Employment Practices Act, public housing and slum clearance, long-range environmental and public works planning, and government promotion of scientific research. Later, he added federal aid to education, government health insurance and prepaid medical care, funding for the St. Lawrence Seaway, and nationalization of atomic energy. Essentially, it was Truman's very ambitious domestic agenda through his elected presidency, 1948-49 through 1952 and 53. While ambitious, it was also proposed during a conservative-controlled Congress who fought against the quote-unquote New Deal era liberalism, end quote, and continued expansion of the federal government. Democrat Harry Truman defeated Republican Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York in the election of 1948. Truman won 303 electoral votes to 189 of Dewey's. Truman carried 28 states to Dewey's 16. It was Truman's first presidential campaign, as he had become president when FDR died in April 1945. Third-party candidate Strom Thurmond of South Carolina also won 39 electoral votes, carrying 4 states. After World War II had ended, Korea was divided at the 30th parallel into 2 zones of occupation. The Soviets administered the northern half, and the Americans administered the southern half. On June 24, 1950, the armies of Communist North Korea swept across the southern border and invaded the pro-Western half of the Korean peninsula. Within days, North Korea had occupied most of South Korea, including Seoul, its capital. Containment policies forced the U.S. into the conflict. Stalin approved of Kim Il-sung's decision to invade South Korea, beyond the 38th parallel. American forces entered the war on June 30, 1950, with United Nations support. A surprise amphibious landing at Incheon in September forced the North Koreans out of the south and across the 38th parallel. President Truman gave Douglas MacArthur permission to pursue the communists into their own territory, hoping to create a unified, independent, and democratic Korea. A move that went beyond simple containment to an attempted rollback of communist power. However, despite occupying North Korea's capital at Pyongyang, the U.S.-led forces pushed too close to China, forcing Communist China to intervene to protect its own communist interests in the region. In December 1950, outnumbered American forces were forced into a rapid, bitter retreat in numbingly low temperatures. Within weeks, communist forces had pushed the Americans back over the 30th parallel and recaptured Seoul. By mid-January 1951, the rout had ceased, and by March, the UN armies had regained all territory lost, essentially turning the Korean War into a stalemate back at the 30th parallel. Truman and MacArthur differed in their opinion of how to deal with China. Even though most Americans supported MacArthur, Truman relieved MacArthur of his command, essentially creating hostile feelings of Truman in the United States. The fighting ended of the Korean War on July 27, 1953, when the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. The agreement created the Korean Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, to separate North and South Korea, and allowed the return of prisoners. However, no peace treaty was ever signed, and the two Koreas are technically still at war, engaged in a frozen conflict. The loss of 14,000 American lives over a stalemate regarding containment turned American frustration to anger toward their government, foreshadowing Vietnam. Americans had just came off a great victory of World War II, only to lose in a minor border skirmish in a small country. As concerns about the spread of communism in America continued to grow, the House Un-American Activities Committee, even though in place since 1938, was revved up to investigate alleged disloyalties to America and subversive activities on the part of private citizens, public employees, and organizations suspected of having communist ties. HUAC turned to movie industry, arguing that communists had infiltrated Hollywood and were tainting American films with communist propaganda. HUAC also investigated charges of disloyalty against Alger Hiss, a former high-ranking member of the State Department. It was primarily Republicans seeking to cast suspicion on liberal Democrats. The Alger Hiss prosecution transformed Richard Nixon, a congressman from California and member of HUAC, into a national figure, senator, and, later, president. Hiss was not tried for espionage, but was convicted and imprisoned for perjury, spending several years in jail. J. Edgar Hoover was the first director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. He is significant for investigating and harassing alleged radicals and communists. It was a component of the larger Federal Employee Loyalty Program to attack subversion throughout the government and beyond. J. Edgar Hoover would later investigate and wiretap Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders for alleged communist ties. After the detonation of a Soviet atomic bomb in 1949, there arose suspicions that American atomic secrets had been given to the Soviets by American spies. Essentially, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were members of the American Communist Party, were arrested and executed in 1953 for passing on secrets from the Manhattan Project to the Soviet Union through other Soviet spies. Historians now believe that Julius was guilty, but not Ethel. All of this, HUAC, the Hiss trial, the FBI investigations, and the Rosenberg case, created significant concern, a Red Scare, that communism would infiltrate America's systems, giving rise to a climate that was perfect for Joseph McCarthy to exploit. McCarthyism was an enthusiastic and determined campaign against alleged communists in the United States government and other institutions carried out under Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin, in the period of 1950 to 1954. Many of the accused were blacklisted or lost their jobs, although most did not in fact belong to the Communist Party. McCarthyism also included homophobia and racism and became synonymous with the witch hunts. In the 1952 United States presidential election, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower won a landslide victory over Democrat Adlai Stevenson, ending a string of Democratic Party wins that stretched back to 1932. Incumbent Democratic President Harry S. Truman had remained silent about whether he would seek another full term, but the unpopular incumbent announced his withdrawal from the race following his defeat in the New Hampshire primary by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver. After Truman's withdrawal, the president and other party leaders threw their support behind Stevenson, the moderate governor of Illinois. Eisenhower chose a young senator from California who had earned a national reputation for his work on the House Un-American Activities Committee, Richard Nixon. The former World War II commander, Ike, won 442 electoral votes to 89, winning 39 states to Stevenson's 9, and winning 55% of the popular vote. Republicans also won control of both houses of Congress. Conclusion. Even during World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union were allies, it was evident to leaders in both nations that America and Russia had quite different visions of what the post-war should look like. Very quickly after the war ended, the relationship between the world's greatest powers soured. Americans came to believe that the Soviet Union, like Hitler's Germany, harbored dangerous expansionist ambitions. Soviets came to believe that the United States was trying to protect its own dominance in the world by encircling the Soviet Union. The result of these tensions by the end of the 1940s was the Cold War. In the early years of the rivalry, the United States constructed a series of policies designed to prevent both war and Soviet aggression. It helped rebuild the shattered economies of Western Europe through the Marshall Plan to stabilize those nations and prevent them from becoming communist. Americans embraced a new foreign policy known as containment that committed it to keeping the Soviet Union from expanding its influence further in the world. The United States and Western Europe formed a strong and enduring alliance, NATO, to defend Europe against possible Soviet advances. In 1950, the armed forces of Communist North Korea launched an invasion of non-Communist South Korea. To many Americans, the conflict seemed a test of American resolve. The Korean War was long, costly, and unpopular, with many military setbacks and frustrations. In the end, however, the United States, working through the United Nations, managed to drive the North Koreans out of South Korea and restore the original division of the peninsula. The Korean War hardened American foreign policy into a much more rigidly anti-communist form. It undermined the Truman administration and the Democratic Party and helped strengthen conservatives and Republicans. It greatly bolstered an already powerful crusade against communists and those believed to be communists within the United States, a crusade often known as McCarthyism, because of the notoriety of Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, the most celebrated leader of the effort. America after World War II was indisputably the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the world, but in the harsh climate of the Cold War, neither wealth nor power could dispel deep anxieties and bitter divisions.